And I also wanted to talk about, as you go around the tables, you can see different elements of the story, obviously. For example, the illustration that we decided to put on the cover of my book, that was done deliberately. The University of Texas Press hired a photographer. He wrote down to Corpus this and several of the other photos in the book. Because right around the time that we were bringing the book out, that was when the decisions had been made to tear down the old Harder Bridge, which is a beloved local landmark thing from the 1950s, and replace it with a much higher and longer bridge. And the reason that they had to do that was obvious to accommodate present day. The bridge was over the ship channel, and it was obviously needed to accommodate present day shipping traffic, as this was needed to accommodate traffic in the 1950s, and that's a big part of the story of Corpus Christi. There's also representatives from the Historical Commission of Good People who reside there. There's the Fulton Mansion up in Fulton, which has a connection to the story of Corpus Christi. And then, of course, there's the representatives from the archives and the Blucher Institute at Texas A&M University of Corpus Christi, where I did most of this work. And one of the things I hope comes out in the book and in other writings I've done about Corpus Christi and in the talk today, it's just what a wonderful collection of materials that Texas A&M, as well as the Corpus Christi Public Library, put together. Texas A&M Corpus Christi is strong in a lot of things, but one of the things that's especially strong in, it has just about the best collection I've ever seen, I've ever worked with, of sort of printed materials of all sorts, with pamphlets, you'll see brochures, programs, those kinds of things, as well as regional history books related to a particular city. And if you're interested in South Texas, it's just a great place to work. And so I'm hoping that you see that influence of that in the book. Now, when I was asked to do this talk, I went through and I started looking at maps I collected and collected and sorting through the ones I might want to show and talk about a little bit. And I found as I was going through my boxes and boxes of materials and sort of, my files that I had digitized, that I probably in the hundreds of maps that I've collected of all sorts, a lot of them are planning maps, projects for the Port of Corpus Christi and so on. One of the things that jumped out at me, given the nature of the GLO's book, Texas Takes Shapes, is that I emphasized in my own work very few 19th century maps, even though, of course, Corpus Christi dates to the Texas Republic, to the late 1830s. And that has to do with how I really understand Corpus Christi's development as a city and what I was focusing on in putting together this book. While so much of the sort of the identity and lore of this part of South Texas reflects, sort of relates to stories, the region's role in the Texas Republic, in the Spanish era, in the Mexican era, Texas Republic, the Civil War, and so on. The Corpus Christi as a city is really just a story of urbanization in Texas overall. It's really a story of the period after the 1870s, involving railroads, land development, commercial agriculture, and eventually the development of the oil industry and related industries, petroleum, petrochemicals, refining, and then all kinds of energy-using industries, metals, and so on. And it's all really a 20th century story. So you notice that most of the maps that I use are from the 1890s, early 20th century, especially after 1919 and 1926. 1926 being the opening of the Corpus Christi ship channel, the Deepwater Port at Corpus Christi. To me, that is the story of how we understand the environments that are all around us. And that sort of booking comes through in the talk that I'm giving today. So I wanted to start with just, if some of these things are drawing from other historians, just how we understand the urban West. And in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, there was a whole spate of research by urban study scholars or urban historians about the phenomenon that become known as the Sun Belt, which of course is one of the most, in terms of just reshuffling the demography and geography and where people live and how they live in the country, is one of the most important trends of the 20th century. In 1910, all of the largest cities in the United States, and in unimaginable possible exception of San Francisco, were in the old industrial belt between Boston and Chicago. By the 1980s, half of the largest cities in the United States were in the West and the Southwest. That's, of course, continued. This is a massively important trend. And there are various ways of trying to map this. As those of you who were influenced as students by, say, Walter Prescott Webb and the idea of the Great Plains, this is one sort of way of anatomizing how we understand the urban West. Thinking of the 98th meridian, a line running right through Texas roughly, sort of the gateway to the arid high plains, then the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and then the West Coast. I'm going to keep coming back to the question of aridity because Corpus Christi is on the edge. It's a port city. There's really a gateway to arid South Texas. And that's a way of sort of that we can all together, right, think of the urban dimension in Texas and the West. The landscape is large, but the people are concentrated. And geographers will often talk about certain types of urban societies, including the American West, would be oasis civilizations. And I often think, and I wrote in the book, that sort of the imagination goes into the empty space, but our lives are oriented around cities. There are other geographic representations that historians, these first two maps come from the work of influential historian of the urban West, a man called Carl Abbott, who spent a lot of time in the 1980s, 1990s, sort of wrestling with this issue of how we understand the urban development of the American West. And here's another representation from another one of his book. Another geographer from the 1960s, one of the best American historical geographers, was a fellow called D.W. Meinig, who was a professor at Syracuse. And he wrote a book that some of you might have read in the past called Imperial Texas, published in 1969. And what Dag really talked about is, and you can also do the same as you can see here for California, is how we understand sort of where influence, right, spreads out, how the economy, how commerce, finance, trade, industry are organized, and I'll have some other representations of this in the West. And if those of you who have connections to the oil industry, you understand the long-term history of the oil industry in, say, Colorado, or even in places like Edmonton and Calgary, started in some level as extensions or offshoots from the oil industry, as opposed in Texas and Oklahoma in the early 20th century. And so in kind of in economic geography, development sense, you can think of much of the West, the urban West, as extensions of Texas, of Corrino, Texas, and of greater California. And one of the things I like about this map is you think of sort of the Matzo claims of the Republic, land claims of the Republic of Texas in an economic sense, a kind of regional economy sense. Texas in the 20th century, you built that. And then I wanted to sort of focus more directly on the geography of which, the site on which Corpus Christi is ultimately built. Jim Blackburn, some of you may know, is an environmental scholar and lawyer and policy scholar connected to Rice University. And he's done a wonderful set of books. One was called, This is Where This Comes From, Texas Plan for the Texas Coast. Another one is just this wonderful book that A&M published called The Book of Texas Bays. And one of the things that you have to sort of be thinking about, if you're thinking about the cities of the Texas coast, including Corpus Christi, Beaumont, Port Arthur, Houston, and Galveston, ultimately the most important, is that basic geography that confronted Texas as they were moving in. If they were thinking about sort of a staging ground or launching point for settlement and ways of connecting to the continental, to the American, and to the continental and the world economy, Texas has lots of bays, as you know, lots of estuaries, but almost across the board, the bays are shallow, 6, 8 feet. Sort of there's natural depth. The passes are frequently blocked by sandbars. And this posed just a massive challenge to the development of Texas as a shipping, commercial, urban center, as a place where commerce on a large scale could really concentrate. And that's what he's trying to represent in these maps. One of the advantages that the Texas has, and that Corpus Christi in particular has, are the barrier islands, which of course are formed by the wave action over millennia or hundreds of, millions and hundreds of millions of years. And so while the coast is shallow, certain sites within it will be semi-protected for storms. And so the challenge of developing port cities and the sort of commercial transportation network along the Texas coast is how do you then take advantage of that protection, but provide for access in so much of the soil development ties that surrounds. Here's another way of looking at just a natural environment that comes from Texas Parks and Wildlife, right there. Also thinking in terms of ecosystems, bays, estuaries, barrier islands, the Laguna Madre, and so on. So, focusing more in, if I have time, we'll talk about environmental coastal research is just developed in Corpus Christi, as well as the University of Texas Marine Science Institute, which I run Port Aransas. And their research helps you sort of understand the geography that people like Henry Lawrence Kinney, the Pennsylvania land speculator, we had a talk earlier which talked about Davy Crockett as in the land business. So many people who came to Texas had backgrounds in that. Kinney was a Pennsylvanian who had experience and also went bankrupt in the Panic of 1837 in parts of Illinois where I live. But if you're looking at the landscape and you're thinking about sites to place towns potentially, and you're thinking in sort of your geographic and political terms, Corpus Christi Bay makes a lot of sense. Even though the bay is shallow, it's 20 miles inland, semi-protected, but also everybody in the room knows that it's the first plausible site for a town south of the Nueces River. And given the reality that some of the people who wanted to engage in trading in South Texas in that time wanted to do so in ways that they were dealing contraband, different Mexican factions, and so on. The story of Henry Lawrence Kinney, the town founder of Corpus Christi during the Texas Republic, is itself a very dramatic one. But that site in the no man's land and disputing the territory, that's really a good way of thinking about sort of the basic sort of origin of Corpus Christi. And you can just see it, right, looking either from the aerial view that the Coastal Science Institute at Texas A&M University Corpus Christi published a book about the Lugaros or Wreck. In the map that they published, you can really understand how this would have looked to the kinds of early Anglo-American settlers who were attracted to the place. Of course, another geography is of the borderlands. And another good way of thinking about Corpus Christi, it's an Anglo-American founded town, but in a region that had long Mexican and eventually Tejano roots. And this is from a geographer at Arizona State University, Dan Arreola, and a book trying to map the Tejano, South Texas. And the site of Corpus Christi is kind of a border gateway into Tejano, South Texas. Of course, there's a map of, and one of the maps pointed out, the first talk today, one of the talks pointed out that that these maps from the point of view of the Spanish and the Mexican were often fictional. They projected a jurisdiction that really still was in the hands of Native American peoples. Some other ways of just thinking geographically about Corpus Christi in its region and in relation to urban Texas. The first map right here is from a comprehensive plan, Corpus Christi's first comprehensive plan done by a St. Louis planning firm in 1953. And what this map is discussing, I'll come back to some other versions of this, is what is Corpus Christi's hinterland, its trade territory, what is its relation to Houston and to San Antonio, to Austin, beyond. Beyond that, there's a more recent, and I want you to think back to that map I showed you of this idea of Greater Texas, a more recent way of thinking about kind of the urban sector of Texas, or the urban dimension in Texas's life, is this concept of the Texas Triangle, of which other places, right? And you could think of also Amarillo or Midland, or more distantly El Paso, but in this case we're talking about Corpus Christi, are really offshoots. So Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, San Antonio, Austin there, right, as a kind of metropole, right, a center for Texas's the sort of urban financial, right, economic system, and these other places existing as kind of peripheral points, almost in a star pattern. And then coming back again to the point of a region and aridity, and I could spend a lot of time talking about how Corpus Christi acts as a kind of central place. I'll come back to the point for South Texas, in addition to acting as a connecting point, right, as an important processing and distribution point for energy. But obviously, people, planners, and agencies, and institutions of Corpus Christi have, and if you follow the news, have over the time, and are currently debating the issue of water. Where should water supplies come from? I think in my book, I estimated that about half of the water supply that comes into Corpus Christi, that could be roughly incorrect, has to go to port or industrial purposes because of the kinds of industries that are there, which means that the city, in addition to its people, just needs massive amounts of fresh water. Where's it going to come from if you're on the edge of a narrow plain? And again, those of you who know sort of these ruminations of the West, either by the University of Texas professor Walter Prescott Webb, The Great Plains, 1931, what defines the West is aridity, right? Lack of water, the shortage of water supply, or Rolf Stegner's Beyond the Country's Meridian, 1954. It's the same question. What makes the West? It's the difficulty of or access to water. I'm going to run quickly through a whole other kind of geography, which is urban promoter booster geography. Urban historian types love this. And the reason is that how is a city going to succeed in the United States? Well, we would be like Austin and acquire an institution which then needs to be there, right? The state capital or a university. But for the most part, American cities are commercial or industrial cities. They're transportation centers. And so they depend upon in competition with other plausible sites for cities, right? They depend upon attracting settlers, investment, transportation lines, and so on. So throughout, you can go back to the other parts of the country, the 1830s and 40s, and those bird's eye views and so on, how they present this place as a sort of natural center, the history of Chicago and all the ways in which it promoted itself as the next great city of the world, which of course it in the 19th century since became. But you see a lot of this in Corpus Christi, sort of imaginings of Corpus Christi from the 1890s and then from the time when the port was developed, right? And then onward through the 20th century, either for industrial or for recreational convention purposes, imagining itself as the center. Of course, other cities in Texas do this. A friend of mine who was a professor at West Texas, a guy called Brian Iglesias, is reference to the Texas Historical Association. I don't know if they're still here in the Southwest. He wrote a book, not a book, but an article in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly a couple of years ago. It's just wonderful for those of you who are Dallas, Fort Worth people. It's just about where the idea of the metroplex comes from. But another way of thinking about your city as the place where everything comes together. You can envision Corpus Christi as the gateway to Mexico, right? Here's from the World War II era. Corpus Christi is a great era of growth. Here's from the 1990s. That image of Corpus Christi, or that understanding, that actually goes back to the town founders. But Henry Torrance Kennedy, but has been submerged at times because of Corpus Christi's really developed most rapidly in connection to the Texas and U.S. urban system. Okay, other ways, NAFTA in the 1990s developed its own sets of geographic imagining efforts to have. You can think of Corpus Christi as a city of the Gulf, right? In ways of imagining its geography in those terms. In terms of how the city developed, right, starting in the 1870s, South Texas know this. It was identified really as the site, as the ranch families consolidated both their holdings and really as Anglo-Texas consolidated their hold over the disputed and often violent territory south of the Nueces River, the Trans-Nueces region, and began to establish ranches and land development operations, began to promote railroads, subdivide their land for farming, to sort of try to advertise, to attract farmers from the Midwest to go there. They identified Corpus Christi as the place that they wanted, that they saw as, well, this is really going to be the urban dimension of our operations. They began doing things like founding local banks, trying to invest in ports, promoting railroads, donating land for churches, building houses on the Corpus Christi bluff, and so on. And so it was really those Corpus Christi grew initially 1870s, 1880s, 1890s as a kind of outgrowth of the development of South Texas overall. And here are a series of maps of railroad lines, all of which converged on Corpus Christi and were promoted 1870s, 1880s, 1890s by a combination of railroad promoters. Some of you might have heard the railroad promoter from Illinois, Uriah Lott, in alliance with families like the Kings and the Kennedys, the Clayburghs, and the Driscolls. The other great development, of course, is the port and the network of ship channels, and eventually the Intracoastal Canal. And the three most important of these, right, the Port of Corpus Christi, Houston, and Bonham Park, for the Sabine Neches Waterway. Both Houston and Corpus Christi were initially envisioned, here's Texas Department of Transportation, right, trying to think about the same thing. Both Houston and Corpus Christi were initially envisioned as outlets for agricultural products. But then as the oil industry developed, that then took over. It was connected, it was Corpus Christi political civic leaders in combination with
John Yance Garner, South Texas Congressman, Nation Key Vice President, who promoted the development of the Coastal Waterway.
So you think of railroads converging and shipping canals connecting, in shipping, opening this place up, right, to ocean-going shipping. And then quickly after that, okay, so one of my favorite maps of all the ones I had originally came from a oil convention brochure, and I published it in several venues, is this one right here of Southern Minerals Corporation and gas lines converging on the port of Corpus Christi. And this is another effort to sort of to kind of map out in the 1950s the gas and oil fields right in the periphery of the port of Corpus Christi.
What this is about is how petrochemical port emerges and how a
port that is focusing on shipping and refining of oil also becomes, like the Houston Ship Channel or Beaumont Port Arthur or Corpus Christi, a major center for other kinds of industries, things like cement and organic chemicals, metals. And the reason is all of those industries use enormous amounts of energy in their manufacturing process. So even though the raw materials might not be in Texas, the cheap energy is. And one of the ways in which Corpus Christi became important was by having local entrepreneurs fund, invest in pipeline companies for natural gas to feed the poor.
I'm almost about out of time because I could talk about sort of how the port's developed,
Ways in which it's been transformed by Eagle Ford, shale oil field, and the development of fracking, and especially of liquefied natural gas.
The connection to Delft is the other end of that. The port is right next to the port of Rotterdam,
Which is the other end of the chain. It's the place that receives the liquefied natural gas to feed the European markets, which, of course, their gas supply was disrupted in 2022 by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so what is the alternative source? It's the liquefied natural gas plants that are being fed by pipelines to huge ship channels in the port of Corpus Christi. And you can see how much, right, the port is being redeveloped, but also the vulnerability to storms and hurricanes. I had tons of stuff that I could have shown you about how the city has itself taken shape, right, over time, because of the influence of the port and because of the other twin development of the early 20th century, the Corpus Christi Naval Air Station, and how then the city then grew towards the southeast into what people think of as the southwestern city cavern, low, stretched along roadways, and multi-sanctuary. I think that I'll stop there and take questions. Oh, here, one more there. Okay, I got dozens here that I could show you, and the ways in which political boundaries expanded onto Padre to comedy. I'll stop there.